The Carter-Jenkins Center will present today a lecture on the very interesting and complicated subject of the complexity of the historical development of the theory of female sexuality in psychoanalysis by Freud and by others. There you have the person that is speaking to you today. And I need to let you know that this lecture is based on the first chapter of a book on female sexuality and the Oedipus complex that I wrote years back as a result of my work with Anna Freud at the Hansel Clinic. The book incidentally has a very nice introduction by Anna Freud. But let's go to the historical perspective and development of the theory, which is quite complex. And as you know, Freud was enormously influenced in his thinking about this particular issue by some female analysts, particularly Jean Lampel de Groot, a Dutch analyst, very distinguished, that contributed significantly to these concepts, which Freud immediately accepted and adopted in his thinking. The development of psychoanalytic ideas about the Oedipus complex and female sexuality generally proceeded very gradually and very slowly. For this reason, terms that were appropriate for the original and more simple formulations became ambiguous, insufficient, and at times contradictory when they were applied to the more complex formulations that arose from further insight and the unraveling of innumerable complications that concern this subject. Unfortunately, when a student or a casual reader selects specific papers from a particular phase in a long line of historical development, he may or she may not be aware that the same terms were being used with connotations entirely different from those of later or earlier papers. Nevertheless, no conceptual difficulties need arise if the student approaches this subject historically, following the development of the concept gradually over the many years in which this happened. When the historical line is taken, it is usually clear in Freud and in others' analysis what developments, changes, amplifications, reformulations, and the like have been taking place, even though the terminology may have remained the same. As the complexity of female sexual development and the female Oedipus complex became better understood, Freud himself became dissatisfied with the inappropriateness of the 16th terminology. Mac Brunswick, who had been collaborating with Freud in the study of this problem, described his views, that is, Freud's views in 1940. I should like to offer a suggestion made by Freud in our early discussion of these problems. The terms active and passive Oedipus complex are more comprehensive accurate in their application to both sexes than the usual terminology of positive and negative Oedipus complex. According to this new terminology, the pre-Oedipal sexuality of the girl becomes an active Oedipus complex with the mother as its object. A passive Oedipus complex has the father as its object. For the boy, the active Oedipus complex denotes what we ordinarily call the positive Oedipus complex, with the mother as the object of his interest. His passive Oedipus complex, which we ordinarily term the negative Oedipus complex, has as its object the father, and is a neurotic phenomenon when occurring to any marked significant degree. To my mind, though, even this terminology, with its obvious advantages, cannot sufficiently characterize the various possible Oedipal constellations. In any case, the increasing complexity of the subject and the fact that different authors use these terms with more than one meaning, at times even in the same paper make it necessary to look at the problems involved to attempt a clearer classification and set of definitions, which I will do in a number of lectures that will follow this particular one. Let's now look at female sexual development and at Freud's earliest views. Freud had established the existence of the Oedipus complex by the summer of as early as 1897, as we can see from his correspondence with Fliess. He described it for the first time in his published papers, though, in the interpretation of dreams, which, as you know, date from 1900. Though he did not at that time use the term Oedipus complex as such in his published writings until 1910. From 1897 to 1919, Freud assumed, and this is important, and of course it was a wrong assumption, and so did every other analyst, that the sexual developments of boys and girls leading to the Oedipal complex was almost identical. The only difference being that the boy took the mother as his positive object, while the girl took the father. It was only in 1919, in a child is being beaten, that Freud first referred to the significant difference existing in the sexual development between boys and girls. These differences were spelled out very slowly and gradually in his later work, as his awareness of them increased, and as the contributions of many other analysts, but most especially Abraham in 1920, Lampel de Groot in 1927, and Helene Dodge in 1925, clarified the situation and influenced his own views and formulations. One important repercussion of early theory was that, despite the later recognition of the negative or inverted complex, which in the development of the girls precedes the move toward the father, Freud and others continue for some time to use the term pre-Oedipal, preserving Oedipal for the succeeding attachment to the father, which in my view creates quite a problem, as we will elaborate in other lectures. Freud himself corrected this situation on his paper on females and sexuality, which dates from 1931, but still some ambiguity remains. He said in that paper, quote, "Since this phase allows room for all the fixations and repressions from which we trace the origin of the neurosis, it will seem as though we must retract the universality of the thesis that the Oedipus complex is the nucleus of the neurosis. But if one feels reluctant about making this correction, there is no need for him to do so. On the one hand, we can extend the content of the Oedipus complex to include all the child's relation to both parents, that is the triangular relationships, or on the other, we can take due account of our new findings by saying that the female only reaches a normal positive Oedipus situation after she has surmounted a period before it that is governed by the negative complex. In the paper from the history of an infantile neurosis published in 1918, but that was written in 1914, Freud does not refer to the Oedipus complex of the patient as an inverted one, and in the introductory lectures that were written in 1916 and 17, he referred to its possible variations or its possible reversal. But the general impression one gathers is that these were considered as possible alternatives and not obligatory concomitants. In fact, up to the publication in 1923 of the Ego and the Id, it was mostly the positive aspects of the Oedipus complex that were predominant. In that work, however, Freud makes clear that the simple Oedipus complex is by no means its commonest form, but rather represents a simplification of schematization. Now this is important, so listen to what he said. He made clear, quote, that the simple Oedipus complex is by no means its commonest form, but rather represents a simplification of a schematization. Closer study, he continues, usually discloses the more complete Oedipus complex, which is twofold, positive and negative, and is due to the bisexuality originally present in all human beings and in children. Up to this point, the terms utilized remain satisfactory and clearly define the phenomena described. The simple Oedipus complex referred to what he describes now as the positive aspects in boys and girls of the more complete Oedipus complex that included both positive and negative aspects. What you see is getting more complicated indeed, as you will see in the lectures that will follow this one, where we try to clarify this complexity in female sexual development. It gets to be quite complicated and quite important to understand this, to have any therapeutic success when there are problems in such areas. Let's talk now about what is called the negative complex. The terms only became confused, contradictory, and insufficient at that point when further insight led other analysts and Freud himself to postulate that the girl's Oedipal development proceeded in fact in two stages. And that's completely new. And that another stage at which the Oedipal object of the girl was not the father, but the mother, must be interpolated before she reached what was considered up to that time and that point in the development of the theory, an Oedipus complex, including both the positive and negative aspects. This important, tremendously important contribution was made in 1927 by Lampel de Groot, the Dutch female analyst to which I referred earlier. 4 years later, that is in 1931, following Lampel de Groot, Freud stated that the female only reaches a normal positive Oedipus situation after she has surmounted a period before it that is governed by what I call at this point the negative complex. And indeed, during that phase, a little girl's father is not much else for her than a troublesome rival, though her hostility to him never reaches the pitch which is in general characteristic of boys. Now that Freud took so long to establish explicitly in his written work the link between bisexuality that we referred to above and the Oedipus complex, with its tremendous repercussion, is in itself surprising. If we consider that as early as August of 1899 he had written two fleas called Bisexuality, I am accustoming myself to regarding every sexual act as an event between four individuals, end of quote. That was Freud in 1899 in a letter to Fliess. Though Freud and Fliess parted company soon afterwards, and the letters remained unpublished until 1950, it could not be argued that Freud buried this insight suggested by Fliess with the ends of his relationship to him in the three essays in 1905 he had written, quote, without taking bisexuality into account, I think it would scarcely be possible to arrive at an understanding of the sexual manifestation that actually to be observed in both men and women. So as you see, the issue of bisexuality came into the picture in full force at this particular time, though still was not formulated very clearly, and as I said earlier, that is something we are going to attend in the following lectures. Was at this point, anyhow, when the same term, negative complex, started to be used indiscriminately to describe what are two very different stages in the development of the female Oedipus complex. That is, both the phase of the attachment to the mother and the negative aspects of the Oedipus complex proper, attachment to father. And this, and as you say, that's quite confusing, and obviously there are fixation points at this level. Unless this is clear, it won't be possible to handle it in the psychoanalytic situation. At the same time that Freud described the role that bisexuality plays in the Oedipus complex, he pointed out in 1923 that it was this complicating element introduced by bisexuality that makes it so difficult to obtain a clear view of the facts in connection with the earliest object choices and identification, and still more difficult to describe them intelligibly. End of quote. He advised analysts to assume always the existence of a factor which he was calling at this point the complex Oedipus complex, the complete, Oedipus complex, but which did not as yet include the girl's phallic Oedipal attachment to the mother at the preliminary stage of the Oedipal attachment to the father. He added, quote, analytic experience then shows that in a number of cases, one or the other constituent disappears, except for barely distinguishable traces, so that the result is a series with the normal positive Oedipus complex at one end and the inverted negative one at the other, while its intermediate members exhibit the complete form with one or the other of its two components preponderating. At the dissolution of the Oedipus complex, the four trains, notice, the four trains of which it consists will group themselves in such a way as to produce a father identification and a mother identification. And that's the end of the quote. Naturally, with the later discovery by Lampel de Groot of the new stage in 1927, the negative or inverted complex, in the Oedipal development of the girl, the difficulties of assessment and description and the confusion that ensue increased tremendously. Nevertheless, I believe that an examination of the various different lines of development that are involved in the establishment of the Oedipus complex can be very helpful, as I shall show in a later lecture. And there are essentially three important lines of development which I will describe in great detail. With the discovery of these pre-Oedipal changes in the girls, Freud and others, including Lampel de Groot in 1947 and van der Leeuw in 1958, were led to wonder about the possibility of a similar stage in the development of the boy, which, as Freud pointed out, was more or less unknown. Most, however, came to the conclusion that such a phase was specific to the development of the girl, but had nothing to do with boys. In 1931, Freud himself stated, quote, "Thus, in female development, there is a process of transition from the one phase to the other, negative complex, as it was called then, which is quite confusing, to the positive complex, in which there is nothing analogous to the male." Now, I'm not going to go now in the details of why this is confusing, and the use of the term negative complex to refer to this earlier phase in the Oedipal development of the girl can be pretty confusing, because there are several forms of negative complex, and it depends not only on the choice of object, but in the sexual position, whether it is a masculine active or a feminine passive position. Now, the term pre-Oedipal, a further source of possible misunderstanding, arises from the different uses of the term pre-Oedipus or pre-Oedipal. Originally, this was meant to cover the oral and anal phases of drive development in children. When Lampel de Groot discovered the new phase of what they were calling at this point the negative or inverted complex, characteristic only of the female sexual development, she also describes this as pre-Oedipal. And that's pretty confusing, as I will discuss in a later lecture, because this is a triangular relationship, and as such should be in the same footing that the positive Oedipus complex. So, though this usage was incongruous in metapsychological terms, she justified it on the basis that the girl's final Oedipal position should normally be a positive attachment to the father, while the phase we're describing preceded it, that is, the positive attachment to the father. Freud himself, not only for a short time, as we saw earlier, included this stage as part of the pre-Oedipal phase. Thus, pre-Oedipal, included in the case of the girl, the oral and anal phases, as well as the negative or inverted complex, as it was called then. In the case of the boy, it included only the oral and the anal phases, and perhaps a hypothetical phase that was for some time assumed to exist in the boy as an equivalent of the girl's newly discovered pre-Oedipal phase, but that was an assumption that was generally discarded later on. So, when it was finally realized that not such phase, as I said, existed for the boys, pre-Oedipal was once again reduced to cover the oral and anal phases. In short, when this point was reached, pre-Oedipal for the girl included 3 stages: oral, anal and negative complex, while in the boy, only two stages, oral and anal, were considered. One can, in this instance, very clearly see the advantages of approaching the study of this subject historically as the only way to avoid the innumerable misunderstandings and confusions that tend to arise, distortions. To complicate matters further, the same pre-Oedipal stage in the girl is simultaneously referred to as the negative Oedipus complex or as the inverted complex. This is most unfortunate because there are two possible negative Oedipal constellations in the girl that have in common only the object chosen, that is, the mother. All other significant factors involved are different, as we shall see, since they correspond to two different levels of development. This lack of discrimination in terminology obscures the metapsychological difference between constellations and results in practical terms in bypassing, at the very least, misunderstanding substantial aspects of the development of the girl, of her unconscious fantasy life, and the psychopathology that can be associated with it. To my mind, Freud's final decision to describe the negative or inverted complex of the girl as an integral part of the Oedipus complex, not as a pre-Oedipal phenomenon, is a more profitable approach. It is general metapsychological consideration and not just the object chosen that ought to decide if the negative or inverted complex of the girl should be termed pre-Oedipal or Oedipal. To include this complex within the pre-Oedipal stage, as it is sometimes done, obscure its more essential characteristic, that is, its phallic Oedipal nature and the fact that for the first time in the girl's development, a truly triangular relationship has been reached, as I mentioned earlier. Metapsychologically speaking, there are no essential differences between the so-called positive Oedipus complex of the boy and the negative complex, as it was called at this time, of the girl. In both cases, the phallus in the girl is equivalent to clitoris as acquired face dominance. The sexual position is a masculine active one in both sexes, and the object chosen in both sexes is the mother. The degree of ego development and accompanying fantasies are similar, and the level of object relationships and behavioral manifestation generally are more or less identical as well. Lampel de Groot in 1927 stated this quite clearly. She said, she, the little girl, too, takes as her first love object the mother who feeds and tends her. She too retains objects as she passes through the pregenital phases of libidinal evolution. She too enters the phallic stage of libido development. Moreover, the little girl has a bodily organ analogous to the little boy's penis. Physically, she behaved exactly like the little boy. We may suppose that in the psychic realm also children of either sex develop up to this point in an entirely similar manner. That is to say, that girls as well as boys, when they reach the phallic stage, enter into the Oedipal situation. That is, that which for the girl is negative. She wants to conquer the mother for herself and get rid of the father. Freud fully agreed with this formulation on female sexuality, published in 1931, stating that in Lampert de Groot's paper, the complete identity of the pre-Oedipal phase in the boy and the girl is recognized. The sexual phallic activity in the little girl's attitude towards the mother is stated and proven by observation. The whole development is epitomized in the formula that the little girl has to pass through a phase of what was then called the negative Oedipus complex before arriving at the positive one. Mac Brunswick in 1940 also made the following comment, quote, "We have seen how closely the little girl in her active pre-Oedipal attachment to the mother resembles the little boy in his active Oedipus complex. I will, in other lectures, propose a conceptual approach to these problems that will avoid what is obviously still quite a confusing situation as we have described in this lecture, in spite of the different attempts at clarification being made." And that's the subject for tonight. We will have some other lectures where we will describe these different developments in enormous detail and consider all the lines of development that are involved, so that you can see that there is more than one of the, at this point, so-called negative Oedipus complex, and that they are very different in character. The only thing that they have in common is the objects that have been chosen. But the sexual position and the active, passive attitude to the object is completely different in both cases. So there is absolutely no identity between the use of these two terms, and the whole issue becomes obscure and untreatable since it gets so confused. Thank you for your attention.